On a summer day of 1937, the Japanese military began conducting military exercises near the Marco Polo Bridge. But this time, it was different. They hadn't warned the inhabitants of the nearby Chinese town of Wanping, and the local Chinese garrison fired shots thinking they were under attack, and the Japanese returned fire. The Marco Polo Bridge Incident is an event that started the Second Sino-Japanese War, and what some argue to be the start of the Second World War. But before the incident, however, Japanese and Chinese relations weren't very good anyway. In the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan conquered Korea from the Chinese, and after what was known as the Mukden Incident, they also conquered and occupied Manchuria. Later, they set up the puppet state of Manchukuo, putting the last Chinese emperor in power of it. The League of Nations, after a year-long investigation, concluded that the conquering of Manchuria, which I will not go into the details of today, was an unjustified act of aggression, and that Manchuria should be handed back to the Chinese. What did the Japanese do? They just left the League of Nations. But they didn't stop there. The Japanese also participated in another act of aggression in northern China, seizing the territory of Jehol with a no-resistance policy from the Chinese other than resistance from a few various warlords. But in 1936, China put its foot down. They agreed to an alliance with the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, putting a civil war they were going through on hold in order to counter the rising threat of the Japanese Empire. So the tension built up, and it spilled over near the Marco Polo Bridge. The Marco Polo Bridge, named after the 13th century Italian trader Marco Polo, was an important modern bridge between the important cities of Beijing and Nanjing, which was the stronghold of the main Chinese government, or the de facto Chinese government, one could say, which was the Republic of China. The Japanese military has done military exercises near the Marco Polo Bridge and the city of Wanping before, but they usually warn the local inhabitants before doing so. But on July 7th, 1937, they didn't. When the military exercise started, the Chinese garrison at the city of Wanping believed it was an attack, so a few scattered shots were fired and the skirmish began. Shots were fired back and it began to escalate. After all the confusion ended, one Japanese private went missing, and his commanding officer demanded that the Chinese forces allow the Japanese forces to enter the town and look for him. They refused and offered that the Chinese army look for the private. The Japanese agreed. Peace was achieved. Or could have been. But the Japanese infantry decided, instead, to attempt to push into Wanping anyway. The Chinese garrison fired and drove them back. The situation soon spiraled out of control as both sides called for reinforcements. On July 8th, the Chinese allowed 2 investigators to go and search for the Japanese soldier. Even then, the Japanese still fired on the Chinese, and Japanese tanks stormed the Marco Polo Bridge. They overran the bridge, but Chinese reinforcements took it back the next day, on July 9th. In Beijing, the Japanese and Chinese began settling this like 2 civilized Asian countries. China would apologize. They weren't very happy about that part of the deal. Officers from both sides would be punished, and the Chinese and Japanese forces would both withdraw from the region, and they'd live happily ever after in peace and prosperity. Peace for our time, am I right? But even after the shaky settlement, tensions still rose. The Chinese were extremely angered when the Japanese deployed 3 new divisions and started sending more troops to the Chinese border in clear violation of the settlement. The Chinese started placing their troops on the border with Japan, and that, quote, provocation, end quote, led the Japanese to start shelling the Chinese. This escalated eventually into a full-scale invasion of China, hence starting the Second Sino-Japanese War.